My name is Robert Morris. Were many of you expecting to hear me now? Here? Hello? Everybody that thought they were going to hear me, sort of waved your hand at me. Oh, fine, great. I'm going to talk about the main subject of information security, but with a slightly different point of view. In the past, going back years, decades, actually even centuries, people cared about the value of the information they had in cases where it would hurt them financially or otherwise to lose it, but someone else was interested in getting that information because it would help them in whatever it was their activity was. A bunch of people that don't have the information. They can't hear? Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah. What are they laughing at?
Talk.
Huh?
Can you hear him better?
No, do that again.
Is my fly open? No, the first thing that I would like to say, and I'll say it many times over, is that intelligence, either protecting your information or stealing somebody else's information, is primarily a financial business. Now, this is a lot more important than it sounds because people often think, thank you, that they have some other, something else is at stake, but it isn't really. Intelligence is driven by the amount of money available to either protect the information or to exploit the information. Protecting the information you got and exploiting the information you don't got. The organization that I work for or works for, or whatever it is, NSA, had two missions. One, the majority one, was listening to other people's conversations and no doubt doing something about it. The other mission was to protect U.S. communications. It was viewed as vitally important, and both of those activities were assigned to NSA. So that in everything I talk about, I will be dealing with either one or the other of those issues. But what I want you to think about generally is not that such and such a code has been broken or some other code is still good because it's never been broken. That's not the right point of view. The right point of view is that the cost of protection of the information and the cost of exploiting it, that is stealing it. I often use the word exploit where I really mean steal. They should be related. In particular, you don't want to spend a whole lot of money gaining some information that you actually don't care about. I mean, if you've got a listening station in some half-baked country in Southeast Asia, where typically the value of a message that you obtain is a nickel, you don't want to spend $1 to protect it. You want to keep these in balance, and intelligence organizations, in fact, do keep them in balance. They view it as very important because there are not infinite amounts of money. Many people might think that the U.S. intelligence services do have an infinite amount of money, but that's actually not true. They have a limited budget that, in some sense, they have to stay within. When I think about these issues and talk about them, everybody heard of Willie Sutton? Willie Sutton made the great quotation. Somebody asked him, Willie, why do you rob banks? Answer, because that's where the money is. It may seem a silly and trivial remark, but it is neither silly nor trivial. Willie Sutton was doing the right thing. He was getting the money from where the money was. And you don't want to spend a lot of time, effort, money on getting the stuff that ain't worth spending a whole lot of time and effort at. So So Willie Sutton was saying, and in fact doing the right thing. He was, as far as I can recall, a very successful bank robber. Now, is that where the money is nowadays? I don't think so. I have a feeling where the money really is now is in these ATMs that you see all over the place. And each ATM that you see has probably upwards of $10,000, $20,000 inside it. That in some sense, you ought to be able to extract that money. Now, am I going to tell you how to extract the money? No. But I'll at least point out to you that that's a thing that many people, typically we call them villains, would want to do. And many of us would like the banking industry, would like to prevent that from happening. When somebody calls me in and wants to consult on protecting their information, I always start with asking them a number of questions around like this. This information that you're talking about that you want to protect, how much is it worth? How much is it worth to you? And in the sense of, if you lost it to the bad guy, how much would that cost you? And the other is, what is the value of the information to the bad guy that's going to attack it? Only at that point can you really deal in any kind of detail with the issues that they have brought up of protecting their information. We look at the value of the data, the value to us, the value to the bad guy. You'll have to use your judgment as to whether I'm the bad guy or not. That depends on who you are and what your own mission is. Now, an example of when I say that talking about a code being broken is probably beginning with a bad point of view. For example, we hear lots, there's dozens of books published every year that go back basically to the German cipher machine called Enigma. And all you hear about is the Americans and the British spent a lot of time in some place called Bletchley Park in England, successfully reading a very large percentage of all the messages that were sent after being encrypted with this Enigma machine. But was the Enigma machine ever broken? That's a difficult question to answer because breaking is not something that you really are dealing with directly. What you really do is make it expensive for someone to steal your information. That you can do. And how expensive you can make that is an important characteristic of your information and how much the information is worth to you and to them. The question of was the Enigma ever broken, the best answer I can give you is that maybe, maybe not. Or sometimes it was broken, sometimes it wasn't broken. This is, I'll admit, an unsatisfactory way of talking about it, but that is the truth. Even at the best of times, our cryptographers could read only a portion of the Enigma encrypted messages. The rest of the time, often, they could not read them, and sometimes months went by when no one on the Allied side was reading the German Enigma messages. But does this really go back to cryptography? I think not. The first example of the military version of the Enigma cipher machine was stolen by the Polish from a diplomatic pouch. This is, in a sense, a bit hard to believe because diplomatic pouches, you're not supposed to steal things from them. But apparently the Polish didn't know that. Everybody knows that that can't happen. You couldn't possibly steal something from a diplomatic pouch and then return it to the diplomatic pouch later with nobody knowing that you'd stolen it over the weekend. But in fact, that is what happened. The Polish saw a parcel being delivered through the diplomatic chain and said, hey, we'd really like to look at that maybe. So they grabbed it on Friday at the end of business, got it back to where it belonged, sometime on Sunday and got the complete description of the military Enigma, which was somewhat different from the civilian version. And a beginning was made at reading Enigma ciphered traffic. Not perfect, but it was a good start. Now, the German view was that how possibly could a bunch of Polish be successfully attacking a machine designed and put into place by these highly technically trained Germans? With a bunch of Polish against a bunch of Germans, their view was, we perfectly well know what's going to happen in that case. Well, they were wrong. And in fact, the Polish made the beginning of all of the reading of Enigma encrypted traffic. Often you hear that basically it was done by the British and the Americans at this place, Bletchley Park in England. By the way, a nice place to visit. I've been there a fair number of times. But their view that the highly sophisticated German product couldn't possibly be broken by the Polish was just plain wrong. And the Polish began to read it. And when the Polish gave their techniques to the Americans and British a few years later, after the beginning of World War II, then the Allies began reading some of the Enigma traffic. And that grew so that once the war was really started, and there's some question of when World War II really started. Some would say, well, the British called the early part of it the phony war, beginning in the fall of 1939, whereas the actual war began for them sometime late in 1940. But that doesn't matter. They were practicing on what they had then, and they were starting up to arrange that they would be able to read important military traffic when the time came that was important. An odd thing is that Germany, US, Britain, and Japan all had these fancy machines to encrypt their traffic, and they were all designed approximately the same way. They had the same capabilities. I don't mean that they were identical so that you could use machine A against code B, no. But there was a tremendous similarity between the machines of one country and the machines of another country. Is everyone hearing me all right? No problems. One of the things I need to start with is I am going to talk a good deal less about cryptography and cryptanalysis, for good reasons. I'm going to talk more about what I call the 3 Bs: burglary, blackmail, and what's the other one? Bribery, you got it. And all of these are of some importance. And in many cases, getting the encrypted version of this traffic just meant that you were good at, for example, burglary. Now this is Black Hat and not DEF CON, so I probably shouldn't tell a raunchy story, but hey. At one point, now this is a story I don't know to be true, but I have heard it from usually reliable sources. Two spies, a man and a woman, were burglarizing an embassy somewhere. And they were in particular cracking the safe that the ambassador had in his bedroom. And that's how they were getting the information, by finding out the combination of that safe so that they could open it. Problem is that every hour a guard came by and checked the whole place. went through all the floors, checked the whole thing, and then came back an hour later, did the same thing. So that kind of protection you would expect, no problem. Okay, these two spies, one male, one female, went up to the ambassador's bedroom, which is what contained the safe, and began, pick the lock on the safe. I don't know how you do those things, but apparently they did. Don't believe anything I say, by the way. I mean nothing. And all of a sudden, not at the hourly time, but like half an hour later, they heard the downstairs door open. It meant now somebody, probably the guard, had just arrived, and he had just moved up his schedule by half an hour to take a look halfway between the ordinary hourly inspections. So they didn't know what to do. They had about 30 seconds or 90 seconds or something like that to solve the problem of the guard arriving in the ambassador's bedroom, and they solved it in the following way. The woman simply took all her clothes off, and the guard showed up, looked at them, said, "Excuse me," and left. That's probably raunchy enough for Black Hat. But I'm in fact told by several people that the story actually is true, hard as it is to believe. Now, so do you have independent information being true?
I read about this there was a documentary.
They had that in the documentary?
Yes, they did.
You got to be kidding me, but for the moment I'll believe you. But I wish you would tell me later a good reference. I only have one good reference. David Kahn actually mentions it in his book. He's usually very accurate. He's not a cryptographer. He's a very competent historian. Okay, so I'll talk. The Enigma machine was attacked throughout the war, partly by cryptanalysis and partly by burglary and theft. There's no other way to put it. We would steal those machines every chance we got, the British would. Actually, I met the guy who was mainly responsible for stealing German Enigmas, and otherwise he seemed to be a fairly decent guy. Every time we damaged or sank a German submarine, we'd send people on board to steal the code books and the Enigma machine. The part of the Enigma machine, I'm not going to talk about how the Enigma machine works, but there's probably 150 places where you can read about that. We would steal all of the information from a damaged or sunk submarine, sometimes diagonally to get them back. Other techniques were even more outrageous. And the guy I said, I know, good friend of mine, well, he was before he died. The Germans had important interest in the weather. And since weather goes from west to east pretty much in this hemisphere, they were very interested to find out the weather 1,000 or a few thousand miles to the west of Germany, days ahead of time if they were planning some important mission, or just planning to defend themselves against the Allied bombers. So what would happen would be, and these weather ships relayed the weather information encrypted. That's important. What we would do would be to send a destroyer, this is an Allied destroyer, out to that weather ship that was probably somewhere just west of Iceland, and actually sink it. But in the interim, stealing the code books and the setup information for the Enigmas. The Germans apparently never noticed that their weather ships were being attacked by Allied destroyers. They just thought, war is hell. Well, this is true. But this happened time and again. I think the destruction of weather shifts actually in total happened about 4 times, sort of toward the middle of World War II, very early 40s. And they would bring back that information, send it to the code breakers at Bletchley Park, and now they would have, because the weather shifts were sent out for missions that lasted several months, they would typically bring back 3 months' worth of the monthly key information from the weather shift. So this worked out very nicely. You might think that this is dishonest. You might think that, hey, they were stealing this stuff. Of course they were. But that's often the way war is. Now, one of the notions, technical terms that I have to introduce, am I talking to you from here or from those things? Oh, up there. Oh, right where I am. Fine. A crib is a piece of data that you have, however you got it, both in the encrypted form and in the unencrypted form, the plaintext form. So a crib is just a piece of data. Here it is where it did not go through the encrypting machine, and here it is where it did go through the encrypting machine. If you have both versions of the text, encrypted and not encrypted, this goes a long way to being able to read the traffic. Now, I don't mean to tell you that that's all you need and that is, in some sense, straightforward and easy to do. It isn't. It's hard to do, but it can be done. And it would be a good idea to avoid sending the enemy cribs at all for their encrypted traffic, because on the day or week or whatever that you got the message, the crib would help you a great deal in reading the traffic. And here again, I'm going back to the notion that intelligence is a financial game. And you have to decide at this point, how much money are you going to put into? It costs money to send a destroyer to Iceland and sink a German weather ship. Do you want to put that investment in? The decision was made, oh yes, we very much do want to do that. And having that data is worth the cost of sending a destroyer out to Iceland to get it. Now, examples of cribs. Some of these you can believe, some of them are actually very hard to believe. Every German military message began with the letters A, N, X. Who's fluent in Germany? Some tiny number or a lot of people? I see barely nobody. It doesn't matter. It's the way AN is the German word for from. So ANX. X stands for space, blank. ANX just means it's addressed to somebody, and you're expecting the continuation to know who it was addressed to. In any case, every German military message had this 3-character crib at the beginning of the message. And this turned out to be very useful indeed to reading the traffic. That's not all you need, and it doesn't make it a trivial exercise. It's hard, but still it's doable, and that 3-letter crib helped a noticeable amount. That ain't all. The first thing you did in preparing a message for being encrypted and sent was to select a message key. And you were told not to pick ABC for the message key, or, you know, the adjacent keys like ASD. You were told to mix them up quite a bit more than that. But code clerks tend to be somewhat lazy. And I should say right off that I was a code clerk in the early 50s, and I used to encrypt and decrypt these things, and I was probably thinking more about my German girlfriend than I was about the encryption going on. This was after the war. Hey, I was a teenage code clerk. Good title for a book. Anyway, the first 3 letters of a message was a selection of the message key. In case it wasn't received correctly, it was sent twice, which again helped to know the 3 characters were encrypted and sent, and then the same 3 characters were encrypted and also sent. Minimized the possibility of having errors in the message key, but still it gave the bad guy, we're the bad guy in that case, 3 more characters which were useful in doing the decryption. You think that's bad, just wait. The Italians, for reasons that are still unexplained, used to occasionally, like maybe once a week or so, send an editorial from an Italian newspaper, encrypted. That's some crib. They used to run 10, 20,000 characters, so that reading the Italian Enigma messages, because of this strange habit that they had, became absolutely trivial. Just basic. When you've got a 25,000 character, it would be more than that, probably more like 100,000 character crib. There's not much else to do. You've got all the information you need to read the message. Another strange thing was a design notion in the Enigma that doesn't seem offhand to be very important. This was that the encryption machine would take a letter in and spit a letter out at every position. But the design rule was that the letter that came out of the machine was never the same letter as was put in to cause it. So if you wanted to encrypt the letter A, it would come out with any of the 26 letters except A. It would come out as some other letter. This was a design feature, seemingly not very important, but it turned out to have very important consequences. One of the first ones being some young lady in England noticed that a message had been sent. They had not decrypted or anything. They didn't know anything about the message. But a message which, for thousands of characters, never contained the letter U. This is the encryption. Now, this is weird. Why would a piece of text appear that never used the letter U? What their guess was, and their guess was correct, that somebody had been practicing and they just kept typing U into the machine, so that because of that rule I just spoke of, because the result of continually typing a U into the machine meant that letters came out that were never a U. And they assumed that this is what happened. They were right, and that gave them the encryption keys for a whole month. Hey, thank God for little papers. It is still an unknown mystery why they would send encrypted editorials from the Rome newspaper. But, hey, you take what you got. Another thing that a crib, where you've got the encrypted and decrypted version of the same text, begins to be very useful somewhere in the range of 20 to 30 characters. If it gets noticeably long than that, you have considerably shortened the time and cost of decrypting traffic that month or that week or whatever it is. By the way, if any of you got any questions, I'm a rather experienced speaker, and I'm not bothered by interruptions or questions, so by all means do. The problem is with these lights that look as if I was in the midst of a police interrogation. I may not see you, but give it a try. When the Germans sent a message that referred to a high-ranking officer, suppose some big deal was visiting North Africa or something like that, they would always include his name in the message. Excuse me, and they would never. My voice is gone. It's my voice is gone. That would be a good idea. Oh, yeah. Good stuff. Many thanks. It seems to have worked, at least partly. A message that contains the name of a high-ranking officer, never abbreviated the name, always spelled out, and title. German military titles, the names of ranks. Complain if you can't hear me well enough. I'll try to speak louder, but So you had a title of a German officer, Obersturmbannführer. Now the nice thing is that's about 25 characters long, and if you have some reason to believe that that was sent because you knew that that's the name of a very high-ranking SS officer. Why I should become an expert on the ranks of SS officers in World War II is a mystery, but the hell with that. So you would be able to guess that the text, Obersturmbannführer, appeared in the text that you're reading, because such a thing would always be addressed that way, not abbreviated. So you can assume that appeared in the message. And now, because of this rule, a letter never encrypted into itself, all you had to do was run these messages past each other, and if you came to a place where the letter in the encrypted and decrypted version were the same, that couldn't be the right thing. So shift down one and try again. So you would be able to place this crib correctly into the text. Helped a lot. It just makes the whole process of decryption substantially easier than if that had not been true. And they did that constantly. To some degree, we did too. And by the way, I shouldn't mean to say that the Germans were dumb and everybody else was smart. Better say everybody was dumb. And some of these are so dumb as to be unbelievable. The British used a code called Admiralty Code 12, and they used it during World War I. It was read by the Germans during World War I, and the British knew it was read by the Germans in World War I. They still used it in World War II. Hey, don't laugh. It was used to send the routing of convoys across the Atlantic. Not very funny, right? And a lot of people who don't know that would be quite disturbed to discover that, in fact, Admiralty 12, Code 12, which had been read by the Germans throughout World War I, was still in use in World War II to actually plot the destinations and the route of convoys across the Atlantic. I can't believe it, but it's true. Sure. This has nothing to do with Enigma now. This is the British using a code read by the Germans. I think that's what he said. They didn't know it was being used in World War II. Hey, they could have guessed. It was used only in the latter part of World War II, not in the early part. The British knew part of the time, but not all the time. Sorry I can't give you a more decisive answer, but there isn't a more decisive answer. The Germans did dumb things. The Italians did dumb things I talked about. The U.S. and Britain were slightly smarter, but not much. And the people who tried very hard were, oddly enough, the Japanese. And I don't know of many really dumb things that were done by the Japanese. Their codes weren't good enough, but that's not dumb. That's just, you know, the way life is, that the codes weren't good enough. They were not expensive enough to read. But they did use a rather good machine for encryption. It's the Japanese I'm talking about. And they did manage to, when they thought that the codes might be too weak and that somebody might be reading it, they would typically change to a better machine. Usually a completely different machine of a similar design but not identical design. We had very smart people working the problem of cryptanalysis on that, and they would typically find that suddenly they couldn't read anything because the Japanese had changed the machine, and it would take them often quite a long period of time. Hey, in wartime, 2 weeks is quite a long time. And we were, partly by the efforts of one of our most heroic cryptographers named Friedman, a name that should be familiar to anybody in this business, kept up with this kind of stuff and was able to get back to reading these codes just weeks or a few months after the machine had been changed. The Germans often suspected their machines were weak enough that messages might be read, and what they would do was appoint a committee, usually a high-ranking committee of technically very competent people, who would issue a committee report in response to what they were asked to do, and they always came back and said, hey, everything's just fine. We couldn't possibly read this. And this is documented, and this particular activity took place some 3 or 4 times during World War II. That a high-level committee was appointed, and basically the report was a whitewash. That, of course, they were helped by the notion that since the Germans designed this machine, it must be top-flight stuff. And, okay, so they were wrong. And we kept reading them. Now, I don't think very much about unbreakable codes. What I think about is codes that are hard to read or codes that are easy to read. And by that I mean expensive and not expensive. So rather than thinking about unbreakable codes, I would rather think about, and I do rather think about, codes that are expensive to read. Unbreakable codes? No. Now, you might also conclude that I'm taking the view that cryptography is nowhere near the center of information protection. It's just one method. And if the cryptography is cheaper than other methods, like burglary, bribery, whatever, then you use the alternative means. When there are cases when cryptography is the cheapest way to go, cheaper, for example, than burglary, you go that way. And what is the balance now? The balance is not too far from being even. I mean, it's sort of within the 2-to-1 range in both directions. That a significant part of the time, the cryptanalysis is a useful way to read messages, and significant part of the time that you want to go for burglary, and burglary does happen. just as important as those is carelessness. You don't want to put teenage cryptographers in the main line of your important traffic, as I was for some years in the mid-1950s. Can you? Walker and Whitworth? Yeah. He was a teenage code clerk, a little bit old for being. The horrible thing about that, two horrible things. One is it lasted a long time. I still find it hard to believe that the Walker bunch was reading those U.S. Navy codes for more than a decade. And somehow or other we didn't notice. There's some audit process going on here that just didn't happen in that case. Certainly should have. But yeah, the Walker business, what he had was the keys, what Walker had was the keys to all of the codes that were used to send broadcast messages to the fleet. It didn't do much, as a matter of fact, other kinds of things. If you were sending a message to a particular ship that was, for example, going into action, Walker didn't have access to those codes, but he did have access to all of the codes that were being sent to the whole Navy, to the whole fleet. And it should be very embarrassing, but apparently it wasn't very embarrassing. Was somebody fired? Not that I ever heard. Somebody demoted? Not that I ever heard. But other kinds of things that fall way outside the notion of cryptanalysis and are more in the league of burglary, bribery, and blackmail. The French government noticed that it was losing a lot of information that it thought was highly protected. So the French actually looked into this issue and the intention of finding out why are we losing all of this important and valuable information. The reason goes like this. Typewriters sometimes break. And these fancy new IBM typewriters, that have the printing balls and things like that, things go wrong with them sometimes. You send them out to get them repaired. Where do you send them? Obviously, you send them to the Russian typewriter repair company. They did. And in fact, it later involved a number of governments, which I won't specify, but it started with the French. And they discovered that there had been a slight modification in the typewriter, so that in a portion of the typewriter where you could hide very small things, there was just a little wire and maybe a chip or something like that stuck into the typewriter, which would broadcast very low level. It would broadcast information that was being typed where. Well, it shouldn't surprise you too much that it was information being typed on the ambassador's typewriter. And this went on for some period of time, not 10 years, but it certainly was years. And it was not just the French typewriters, it was a number of other typewriters. So this was an oddity. But there are other oddities. Suppose you have a handheld radio that you want to use in tactical situations, like with the Army when the Army is fighting. And this radio, handheld radio, encrypts the traffic, of course. You normally do that with a machine that's being used in the field. You would typically expect that it would be encrypted, and yes, indeed it was. they again sent the broken radios, or defective radios, out to the local radio shack in whatever country it happened to be in, U.S. or Bulgaria or whatever. And for a long time, typewriters that needed repair and were repaired would come back with one little extra wire in them, and they would be broadcasting the information. And this is a peculiar thing. The reason it was not found was the handheld radios were broadcast on FM. And if you want to see where anything is going wrong, you listen to it on FM. What the target country did not understand was that in addition to the ordinary FM signal coming out of the handheld radio, there was also a very weak AM signal. And hard to hear because it was much, much lower power than the normal FM signal, but enough that it could, with some difficulty, be listened to and read. And this went on for quite a long period of time with a number of countries that were opponents. Again, I won't specify. I'm not good about specifying any country that did anything. I mean, not that it's highly secret or something like that, but just it's an area that I prefer to stay some distance away from. Suppose you have 500,000, well, I better get a little introduction. In the oldest days, most important encrypted traffic was encrypted because it was being used by the army, by the military, or diplomatic. You would find other minor uses, but these were the main uses used by large countries. The point of information protection has changed somewhat, so that now we're deeply interested in whatever is the appropriate way of getting information. A large bank had information about the credit card accounts of 500,000 of their customers. Now, this is not a new story. This is something you could have and should have read about within the past month or two. And I read it in the Washington Post and the New York Times. The way that this information was handled was as follows. It was unencrypted. They needed to send it from the central bank to some other data processing location. And the way they did it was on the appointed day, a UPS driver drove up his truck to the headquarters back door, and somebody went out and handed to the UPS driver the credit card records of 500,000 of their customers that was unencrypted. Just handed it to the UPS driver. Bad? Well, the fact is that this information has since then never been seen. No one knows where it is. No one has found it. It happened twice. And the fact is, nobody has the slightest idea what the implications are, except the possibility of 500,000 cases of identity theft. Because, after all, what used to be all military and diplomatic has now become people after identity. For identity theft is a highly profitable business to be in. Don't tell anybody I said this, though. It would show the wrong, that I have the wrong approach to things. The major banks, Citibank was one of them, and And whether it was UPS or FedEx, I'm not sure. I think it was UPS. But you can find that in the newspapers. About 20 articles about the subject have appeared in major newspapers over the past 2 or 3 months. But now, I've talked a bit about the carelessness in handling data. But let's think for a bit about ATM. I don't know about you guys, but all my money, all the money that I have, all the money that I get comes from ATM. I mean, I've probably got at least $100 or so in my wallet. What do I get? That's when I got an ATM. That's, as far as I know, where everybody gets their money. Probably where everybody gets all their money. But ATMs are a technology swamp. Trying to figure out who you're protecting and what you're protecting them against is a very difficult problem. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about that today because I'm talking day after tomorrow. Day after tomorrow. About ATM and going into some of the details about how it operates and what it is protecting, who is protecting it against, and how we can keep it in good enough shape that it does not significantly contribute to identity theft. There's another fact that I can tell you offhand that it's a rather good system. It does what you expect it to be, not stealing your money or sending it to the wrong people. So it's a pretty good job of it. But still, to go back to Willie Sutton, ATMs, that's where the money is. And if you want to attack something and profit from it, ATMs is a good place to go. I think the real problem that we have to face is somehow getting a handle on dealing with carelessness this time, mostly carelessness. People do silly things just all over the place. I gave some examples from World War II. There are other examples that are more recent. But this attack on personal and financial information is getting to be a major source of crime and a major source of income to the bad guys. And I don't know what has to be done to stop this kind of thing taking place, but attacking carelessness wouldn't be a bad idea. I do feel, in general, that industry they invest a certain amount, not an enormous amount, but a significant amount of their money in protecting against damage to information being sold or stolen or whatever, or misused. But I have the view that much of the money is spent in the wrong place. In particular, people who use cryptography often haven't thought hard enough about just what it is they're using cryptography for. And I would suggest that if you think your problems can be solved by cryptography, you're probably wrong. And to provide examples of that, I would have to have them get hold of the examples. But I think if you look hard at it yourself, you'll find that in addition to the burglary and the blackmail and whatever, that some examples of carelessness go beyond ordinary things, much like the Italian newspaper editorials. Let me tell you another story. It can't be believed, but you're going to have to believe it because it happened. Somewhere either during or right after World War II, sometime late in World War II or early in the Cold War, the Russians decided, for good reason, that they didn't want to continue to use these mechanical gizmos that everybody had used during World War II, like Enigma and the U.S., Japanese, and British versions of them. what they did was decided to go to a method that is even theoretically unbreakable. You can't read any of it, and you can prove theoretically that you can't read any of it. It's called one-time pads. I hope you've heard of them. They're important because of this characteristic. With a one-time pad, you send a message using a one-time pad, and no one can read it at all unless they have the pad they're using. The way it works is you have a character from the text or a character from the key, and you sort of add them together in some funny way, and you get the character stream that's encrypted and sent. And in order to decrypt it, you have to find out what the original key was in the one-time pad. Never mind. It's a beautiful, beautiful scheme, and it's absolutely unreadable. Yeah, just wait. Hey, you just listen to my story. The Russians, a particular area of the Russians, the KGB, decided they wanted to go to these one-time pads. So what they did was look in the yellow pages for one-time pad distributor, and found one, and began to use them to send KGB traffic. Now another organization called the GRU, and you don't have to care about what the KGB or the GRU was. They faced the same problem. They needed to send unbreakable codes using these one-line pads. So they looked in the yellow pages for a yellow pad manufacturer. They found one, and not too surprisingly, it was the same one that the KGB used. Well, the one-time pad company discovered a cheap way of manufacturing these. Namely, that for the two organizations, they used the same one-time pad. One-time pad, I better start calling it a two-time pad. And now, if you send out two messages using the same one-time pad, it gets to be possible, and I mean possible, not easy, but just possible, to read the messages. And some bright young female, actually, at NSA or some such organization, discovered that this was happening and began to read the messages. Theoretically, even theoretically, unreadable messages were being read on a routine basis by the U.S. and the Brits. Worked out just fine. It's, anybody who wants to learn more about that, the name of the project was Venona, Venona. And there are, at this point, even books written about it, and reports that give an accurate description. Some of the information that was being sent was, to say the least, horrifying in its implications. The kind of thing that would get people hung or shot. So I'm not sure that happened in any particular thing. Well, yeah, I am sure that it happened. And so that was the incredible piece of carelessness, institutional carelessness, that is probably beyond anything you would reasonably expect. I mean, the story certainly happened. I still don't believe it, because it couldn't, such a careless thing couldn't possibly have happened. Would anybody like to talk to me, to ask questions, do what? I don't need to talk anymore. I think I've covered the basic material I want, and that is that intelligence is indeed a financial organization, a financial undertaking, and you have to use your own judgment as to whether you are putting your money into the wrong place. Things like some of the bad examples, giving the unencrypted credit card data to a UPS truck driver to send it away somewhere is the kind of showing thing that the responsible people of the organization, in that case the bank, should have been paying some attention to. And spending money to see that this kind of audit of information practices is taking place reasonably, that's a place certainly where money should be invested. Protection against burglary is obvious, but people are oddly enough not protected against burglary, even to a small degree. Maybe I shouldn't tell you this. Well, I'll tell you anyway, even though you look like a bunch of bad guys. Bad guys are both male and female, by the way. It's a little sexist term. You have these safes, 3-drawer safes with combinations that require putting 3 numbers into them to open them. And these are used by industry, used by the government, and they are certainly used to protect highly classified information. One is permitted to put top-secret information into one of these safes. I have been told, nah, that's a lie. I know how to open these safes. I know how to open them in such a way that you cannot find out that they were open. Because I can come in at night, an example of burglary. Open one of these safes, photograph or whatever, the documents of the women, close it again, and see to it that it cannot be detected that the safe is open. Now, we use this for very high-level information, and I find it surprising that 20 years after people, bad guys, like me, 20 years after they were routinely able to open these safes, that we're still using them with no change. Me? Would that guy step into the lights over and find out who he is? I mean, this kind of question is okay, you don't have to worry about the burglary. I got into the building, into the room in the building I wanted. And you're just talking about the time when I first begin to do something with the safe and the time when the safe is open. That. I'm relatively incompetent at this, having had relatively little practice, but it's of the order of half an hour. But more important than that